are looking at the Old Testament as a means, historically, as a means to verify what it says theologically. In other words, when we see that the walls of Jericho were real, or that the Hittite nation was an actual group of people, we celebrate it not just because it means that there were really people that were called Hittites, but that shows the Bible is telling us the truth, and that if there was a Hittite nation, then there probably was a guy named Uriah the Hittite, and that story is verifiable. And so all the more we can do to show the historical value of the Old Testament in all of its forms, the better, because that verifies the theological value of the Old Testament.
Welcome to the 28th podcast, Renew Your Mind. With us here today is Senior Pastor Paul Gruenberg and Youth and Family Pastor Jordan Chambers, and myself, Dana Hall, as a moderator. Last episode, we've been focusing on the Old Testament, and at the end of the last episode, we said we were going to talk about covenants, but before we talk about that, this podcast is going to focus in on the historical accuracy, because we think it's pretty important to talk through that before we talk about the covenants. So I'll hand it over to Pastor Jordan because he's the one that reminded us that we needed to talk about that. So
yeah, well, there's a lot of debate in the Christian realm about how historically accurate is the Old Testament.
Jordan, how historically accurate is it?
Well, if you ask me, it's really historically accurate. If you were to ask just a random Christian going to church, hey, do you think the story of Jonah really happened? Mm-hmm. Did a guy really get swallowed by a whale and stayed in his stomach for 3 days and then got thrown up onto a shore somewhere and then preached to a bunch of people and then had this tree that got eaten by a worm and all that? Do you really think that's a real story? Do you think that was just a moral lesson designed to teach us about obeying God? Or, Adam and Eve. Do you really think that Adam and Eve were real people that God just created out of dirt and breath? Or do you think that they were, these different things that just happened to occur? Mm-hmm. Or Noah? Do you really think Noah was a guy in a boat with a worldwide flood? A really worldwide flood? Maybe it was just an area that got flooded and he couldn't see any land.
Sure.
All of these stories that we use, or even, the Old Testament or Daniel's lion's den and the 3 men in the furnace, do you really think those actually happened, or do you think that it looked like they happened?
Mm-hmm.
The question I would have is, do you think God is powerful or not?
So, I had a guy who we went to college together, and when it came to the Old Testament, almost every miraculous event, all the supernatural stuff, he rejected. He would say, no, that doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. It doesn't follow science. It's not scientifically possible. And since it's not scientifically possible, to me, there's no way it happened. It's way more likely to him that it's just myth that teaches us something than it is history that tells us something that happened. Mm-hmm. And I would ask him, well, do you think Jesus Christ rose from the dead after he died for 3 days? He's, oh, yeah, absolutely. Oh, okay.
Wow. So God can do this.
Within the realm of science, that does not happen that often, It's just... Right. So the thing is, and there's often this battle is pitted that it's either the Bible or science is right. And I think that's an inappropriate way to put it, because while there are many unscientific stories, if you will, in the Bible, and if they actually happened, science would have to be defeated in several ways. Mm-hmm. If God is truly the creator and author and is truly real, then it is totally within his power to alter science at his will. Mm-hmm. He can go outside the realm and then go back in anytime he wants. We can't. I can't part waters. I can't make pillars of fire and clouds. I can't, raise up from the dead or stay alive inside a fiery furnace. But God can make sure that the physics of all those things are changed for his benefit if he wants to.
Just talking about that, it just strikes me, one of the big events that happen for the United States are the hurricanes and those types of things. And a tsunami has happened a few years ago, and those are important. And what happens is, in a tsunami, there is a shift in the tectonic plates and it creates, or a volcanic eruption, and it creates a wall of water.
Yep.
Well, I have never seen a wall of water 3 feet high, other than a wave, rather than 20 or 50 or 100 feet high. And in the Old Testament, when you talked about crossing the Red Sea, that couldn't happen. Or they say, well, it wasn't that deep. And then you think, well, okay, if they crossed and it wasn't that deep, then how did Pharaoh's army
Yeah, that's
die
miraculous by itself.
by drowning? So it talks about God over that night blows, an east wind blows, and it's a real hard blow. And I was watching this program, and it was showing that if you blow enough, that it will clear the water away. And it was God using a natural, we look at hurricanes. Now, those are some pretty heavy winds, and it creates high surges or high walls of water. Well, why can't that heavy wind push the water and dry the land? I mean, it was a natural way of God using the earth to do something that would provide a journey or a safe passage for the Israelites, and then stop the wind and the water comes back.
Yeah.
So scientifically, we can show that it could have happened that way. But then in my mind, I'm thinking, well, if God, who created everything, can't use science or a natural wind, in this case, it would have to be a pretty high wind, to blow the water away, then God could probably just say, part the water.
Yeah.
Right?
To me, one thing we do have to be careful of is just saying, well, God's powerful enough to do whatever he wants. So whatever's in the Old Testament, I just believe at face value because, God can do that. A lot of other religions do that with their deities, and they make extravagant claims that are quite outrageous and hard to believe. And someone who's not a Christian hears you say that is probably going to be like, well, then all you believe in is magic and it's not real. And everyone believes in that. And so why would I believe in that? Yeah. So it's not very attractive, even though that is not necessarily a wrong answer theologically to say that God can do everything. It is helpful for the sake of evangelism and other reasons to really find out ways that it's possible. We've had,
like you said, it's kind of a cop-out by not doing your homework
Yes.
to explain how and why it could happen.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
And again, I do believe supernatural events have happened. I believe they happen even more often now than they did in the Old Testament. But at the same time, natural events happen, and they also reflect the glory of God in extravagant ways. And it's possible for us to show in natural ways evidence of supernatural, or at least natural events that are extravagant. And so when it comes back to a lot of those things, in modern science, one area where I guess a good way to put it is that everyone is skeptical of the Bible is in its history, because it is a theological work. Primarily, it is about the beliefs of a God and his teachings, and it includes some historical value and whatnot. But historians and scholars, specifically secular ones, don't consider that history. They would not see the Bible as a reputable work of history. They would say, no, that's a collection of mythic stories that may or may not be based on real events. So they don't take this as their starting point. They take other realms, and you think of archaeology and geology and all these other scientific realms as
More
their starting
tactical.
point. Yeah, very much more tangible, tactical, and especially in archaeology. What I find interesting is the Bible is more often than not proved right in how it tells its stories against the predictions of secular scholars. There's two examples of this in archaeology I can think of that briefly I could mention. That is the existence of the Hittite nation, which is a group of people that really only the Bible talked about, but they were found to have been the second greatest empire underneath of Egypt, basically at its height. And there's archaeology that now reveals artifacts from the Hittite nation. Scholars didn't believe they existed because the only book that ever mentioned them was the Bible. And they said, no, that's probably just, a clan that someone made up. But they were actually a pretty big deal.
I think that was one of Noah's grandsons was a Hittite.
Well, it became a really large, there were a lot of people in David's day. You might remember the story of David and Bathsheba, right? So his Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba, was a Hittite. He was a converted Hittite that was one of David's followers. Yeah. And so they were around for quite a long time, but their heyday was actually during the day of Joseph, during the Egyptian empire there. Another one is the existence of Jericho, ancient Jericho. The Bible, again, was really the primary source of that city. And for a while, they didn't believe that it either existed or B, if it did exist, that it was nowhere near as large as people had deposited. And they accidentally found it because they weren't looking for it. And as they were digging, they found Jericho in its ancient. And the thing about Jericho is it had been rebuilt. And the very famous story of Jericho is the walls that came tumbling down, right? Well, Jericho had been rebuilt several times after that. So the Jericho they found was the most recent layer.
On top.
which it was probably alive during the time of Jesus, because he talked about the story of the man going from city to city and beaten in between, and they took him to Jericho to heal the Good Samaritan. And so you have archaeology that actually supports the Bible in its history. There are, within Christians, even those that would say that the Bible is historically accurate, there are those who say, but some of its, quote, history is not actually history, that it's more poetic story. And I think the greatest example of that would be the creation story. And there's a lot of debate right now amongst Christians everywhere whether or not God used evolution and that process came about, and thus Genesis 1, 2, and 3 are more poetic retellings of that rather than literal descriptions of it. And then there's different types of creationists which would hold either a young earth creation, meaning it's literally about 6,000 years old, or old earth creationists, which might say it's a couple 100,000 years old at most. Those would say that the creation story is actually talking about the literal ways God made each and every creature and plant and everything else within that time frame. And then there's a lot of people in between with the gap theory and day age theory and all that. And so those people, that's probably a heavier debate on just those 3 chapters and whether that's poetry or whether it's history.
Right.
But what is essential to me is if you believe that it took 1 billion years or if you believe it took 6 days, to me it doesn't matter as much. I happen to believe it took 6 days, but there's no consequence if it took that long. It does matter that you believe Adam and Eve were real, though. Right. It does matter that the sin in the garden that's not just some mythic story. That was a real thing, because otherwise then the entrance of sin in this world is based on a myth, and it doesn't, everything that follows is nothing but myth.
So one of the guys I met at seminary, well, not met, heard, William Lane Craig. And if you ever get a chance to go to his website, it has to do with reason and faith, if you tend to be more scientific. But he presented the creation this way. He said that one of the aspects of the universe or the cosmos nowadays, and we know scientifically that this is true, that it is constantly spreading apart, little bit by little bit. Everything is expanding. And what he said is, if you take that and you reverse it so that instead of expanding, it's coming back together again, it's all going to reach a certain point. And at that certain point, you will have all of this dense material. All of the things that we see would be just this massive, dense something. And then he asked the question, well, where did that come from? Did it just happen to be? Or was it created? And then and then he said, I was a little skeptical, and I've had to think about this through the years, but he said the Big Bang Theory, God speaking things from a point into being. So what God spoke into being, it could have come from this dense material that's we now see as expanding. But again, where did the material come from? Someone had to create the material. It just doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. And then we can look at the beauty of star systems and just the wow factor of those. And I'm going to show them this Sunday. Well, okay, we're recording this a couple weeks earlier, but I want to talk about the stars and the beauty of it, and all creation, everything that's created brings glory to God. And if that doesn't bring glory to God, if you don't, go ahead, Google star systems or NASA will have, or the Hubble telescope will have pictures of galaxies far, far away. And if you don't look at those and you aren't saying, wow, God, then you're not a Christian. but just the idea that even if we went with the Big Bang Theory, we could say without a doubt that someone had to create that which went bang and cast all this, God threw the stars out into the universe and calls each star by name. Just incredible when you think about that.
Yeah, Louis Giglio is another guy that has a really good series on this, and he takes the book of Job, and he dwells on a couple of the spots where he's talking about the constellations. Mm-hmm. Can you loose the bands of Orion, or who can undo Arcturus? And it's some really cool. He just shows what that means.
Slideshow.
And to Google that, it's worth the YouTube. That you'll look that up. William Lane Craig, though, is posited as today's top Christian apologist alive. Mm-hmm. He is the guy when it comes to it. And I know he's a Christian. He's a theistic evolutionist as far as how he believes everything came about. But he was asked about 2 years ago, I believe it was, in a forum, what is the hardest question for an apologist today? And he said, without a doubt for me, it is how to prove the historical Adam. How to prove the guy named Adam. Mm-hmm. That is such a necessity for us. Even as an evolutionist, he believes in Adam, but he acknowledges the difficulty in scientifically proving that, especially from an evolutionary point of view. At best, we can trace our bloodlines, if you will, back to a common ancestor of Noah. But beyond that, because it's impossible to retrace it past that. And so there is some faith that combines, with all of this. And we do remember that we are looking at the Old Testament as a means, historically, as a means to verify what it says theologically. Mm-hmm. In other words, when we see that the walls of Jericho were real, or that the Hittite nation was an actual group of people, we celebrate it not just because it means that there were really people that were called Hittites, but it shows the Bible is telling us the truth, and that if there was a Hittite nation, then there probably was a guy named Uriah the Hittite, and that story is verifiable.
Right.
And so all the more we can do to show the historical value of the Old Testament in all of its forms, the better, because that verifies the theological value of the Old Testament.
Yeah, great point.
Probably the biggest find would be Noah's Ark.
Yeah.
And I remember back in I'm thinking it was the 80s.
They thought they found it, yeah.
In search of Noah's Ark, and they put a documentary together. It went out on the big screen, and I remember my mom and I went and watched it, and the idea that they found pieces of the Ark, gopher wood. Mm-hmm. And then after they had found it and brought it down, they were not allowed to go back in. It's a very guarded area, Mount Ararat.
Turkey is the country, I believe, and the government is not welcoming to Christians and discoverers and whatnot. And they try to preserve it, not just because it's those people, but because they believe not necessarily in the sacredness, but in a historical value of those lands, and they want to preserve it.
Right.
They only want people trotting all over and digging and all of their mountains and hills. Unfortunately, because there is supposed to be a pretty big find out there somewhere.
Right.
You know what would solve it is if we went to D.C. and found that warehouse that they put the Ark of the Covenant in.
That's
Exactly.
From Indiana Jones.
Indiana
I mean,
Jones.
we found it, just a few years ago.
Well, one of the other aspects of the Noah's Ark.
Just look for the melted box.
That's right. One of the aspects of Noah's Ark is that there was a worldwide flood.
Yeah.
And there's another show, it's called Is Genesis History, that I would encourage you to watch. It was on Netflix for a long time. I'm not sure where it's at right now. It's called Is Genesis History. And in that, this guy shows the different layering. He talks about how sediment after a flood settles and why there are various, like if we go out to the Grand Canyon or other places like that where there's a layering of sediment and how that came about as a result of a worldwide flood. And the
design of it is the really important part because the layers are even. If it were over millions and millions of years, they wouldn't be even. But if it were a layer of stuff that went kaboom, and this is the shape of it, it's like if you laid your it's like if you put a whole bunch of Legos on top of a bed, okay? It's going to look a little bit different. And then let's say you put a blanket over top of those Legos, and then you put another blanket. All of those blankets will be form-fitting to the shape of whatever those Legos are. But over millions of years, those Legos won't be there if it were dirt, right? So you wouldn't expect them to have the same shape. But because they have the same shape, you can suppose that those blankets of dirt were laid on top of each other in quite recent succession with each other in a very quick manner, if you will. Or else, for some reason, for millions of years, the weather never changed. And the ground stayed the exact same. The topography, which, again, we live in Michigan. We know the topography does not stay the same. Weather does drastic things to our grounds, I know.
Yeah. So that's another just historical kind of a proof that the flood really did happen, or that it could have really happened because of what we see in the geography, the story it tells. And then we're like, well, that sounds a lot like Noah's flood.
That's right.
Right? So historically, the Old Testament has a lot going for it. And the more historical finds they are finding over in the Middle East, the more they're coming to realize that, yeah, the Hittites did exist, and other nations that we weren't sure existed. Yep, they existed too. So it's really incredible the more that archaeology is finding. When you more it's proving the Bible to be true, the Old Testament to be true.
Yeah. When you find chariot wheels in the middle of the Red Sea, which is really, really wide, you wonder, well, were they just like chariot skiing with, water skis on the front? Or did that thing just, this big, massive wheel float to the bottom in the middle? Or maybe, just throwing this out here.
Maybe it was dry ground for a while.
Maybe, yeah. So, there's so much that otherwise wouldn't make sense. But because of this collection of extravagant claims, and yet the finds that support it, the Bible looks more and more true as you look at those things.
Historically.
Yeah. Now, if you only look at the world in what we call a natural lens, meaning there is no such thing as a supernatural, it's not possible, then the Bible looks ridiculous, specifically the Old Testament. It looks like none of those things could ever happen. That's why the predominant, and I don't want to offend anyone, and I don't want to put this wrong, so I want to be careful here, but it's why the vast majority of scientists reject Scripture. I believe it's upwards of 90% of occupational scientists in America are atheistic. And it's because they have a natural worldview, meaning they don't allow for the existence of a supernatural event. And if you don't allow for the supernatural events to occur, then you must not allow for a supernatural being to occur.
Yeah.
And it obviously does not allow for, the claims made that certain supernatural events altered our earth. And so they're only going to look at our earth's history and all of the events of this earth through the lens of no supernatural event. And you have to find natural ways to do that. And so in order to do that, you have to have either more time or more chance or more whatever. You throw into the formula whatever you need to accomplish that, but it never can be supernatural event.
Right.
That's something that we don't really recognize as a part of our society today, and it really is. It's part of our modernist thinking and our postmodern thinking. And as Christians, we fall prey, I think, too easily to catering to the beliefs of the experts and not understanding exactly what worldviews are predominant right now.
Also closed-minded, though.
It is, yeah.
So, well, good. Well, that's a great point to stop, or great time period to stop here. So thank you for joining us, everyone. Lent season will be here very soon. So if you want to attend our church in person or via Facebook or YouTube, we're located on 215 South Center Street, Gaylord, Michigan. We have a traditional service at 9 a.m. and a contemporary at 10:45 a.m. every Sunday. And if you have any reason that you want to contact the church, you can contact us at 989-732-5380. Thanks for joining us, everyone.